Greetings and welcome to No BS Baking. As usual, you got JP here. Now today I want to talk about the easiest way to make a variety of different products to fit your schedule that require the least amount of work, minimal amount of direct handling, and compared to some other processes, less mess to deal with at the end of the day. For those of you that have been following my videos, you know that I like the overnight refrigerated fermentation process, and for good reason. With some minor yeast adjustments, home bakers can extend this period out to 2 or even 3 days, creating some awesome flavors and finish characteristics master bakers achieve through this type of process. Little work, with time being the real craftsman. Now the process is easy and can be used to produce a broad range of products. It's perfect for those people with busy schedules where the process can be spread out over a day or more. Not only does this give folks some flexibility, but time takes care of a lot of the work by conditioning the dough, and as an added bonus produces amazing flavors, textures, and due to the dough being cool through the processing, way more easy and much nicer to work with. So let's first start off by understanding and making a cold fermentation plan. Long cold fermentation, also known as retarding or slow proofing, is a technique used in bread making where the dough is left to ferment in a refrigerator for an extended period of time, typically between 12 and 24 hours. This process can have several effects on the bread dough, including improved flavor. The longer fermentation time allows for more complex flavors to develop in the dough. This is because the yeast and the bacteria in the dough have more time to break down the starches and proteins in the flour, creating more flavorful compounds. Increased dough strength. Cold temperatures slow down the fermentation process, allowing the dough to develop more gluten, which gives the bread its structure and chewy texture. Better texture. The extended fermentation time can result in a more open crumb and a softer texture in the finished bread. Longer shelf life. Bread that has been cold fermented tends to stay fresh for longer thanks to the increased acidity in the dough. It slows down the growth of mold and bacteria. Next, we need to think about our planned time. Whether time planned is due to our personal schedule or some cool characteristics that you're looking to develop, you need to start here. So after time comes hydration percent, or the amount of water or liquids the recipe calls for. Now we all know that if the same amount of yeast is used in a high hydration dough as say a standard bread dough, you're going to see action a lot faster and way more profoundly in the soft dough. So we need to consider this in our plan. Now instant and active dry yeast are generally very similar with one major exception. Instant yeast is milled into a much finer granules than active dry, which allows the baker to add it directly into the mix without having to dissolve it in water. Now, as a general rule of thumb, active dry yeast can extend the rise or proof times by as much as 25%. So in this instance, you can plan for the extra time or increase the amount of active dry yeast you use by, well, you guessed it, 20 to 25%. Fresh yeast is often the choice of seasoned bakers for the richer, sweeter flavor and better rise performance than dried yeast. That said, as a general rule of thumb, if your recipe calls for 1% instant yeast, then you need to add 2% of fresh yeast, or a ratio of 2 to 1. This process is the same, no different than standard baking practices. The right amount of yeast for the recipe you're using in balance with your temperature and time plan. So now before we move on, let's go through a few common questions regarding the long fermentation processes. There is no set time for bulk fermentation, so don't let anyone tell you that there is. The amount of yeast you use, the amount of water or the softness of your dough, and of course the temperature your dough is exposed to all play a vital role in determining the speed at which your dough will develop. No matter whether you are bulk fermenting in a cold room temperature or a warm environment, the golden rule of double in size or slightly under holds true for most bread products and should always be your target regardless of time. If you don't attain double in size status, you most often will result in a dense, often gummy bread that often lacks oven spring and may feel sticky and can be difficult to final shape. The latter is caused by flour needing that time to completely hydrate and condition the protein, resulting in a drier feeling, more extensible and manageable dough after rest times. Now, this is the basis of autolyse, and many bakers use this process to hydrate their flour in advance of mixing and bulk fermentation, ultimately to improve these ends. So can I bulk ferment for 24 hours or longer? The answer here is yes, but it has to be in the refrigerator. No dough which is yeast leavened will likely last for 24 hours at room temperature, unless maybe you live in an igloo. Overnight fermentation is really all about slowing things down, as you can see by this thermometer graphic. As with pretty much all foods, we need to be sensitive to temperatures. Bacteria, yeasts, and molds thrive at temperatures above 40 degrees. And so if we want to have controlled bulk fermentation based on our yeast levels, we don't want them thriving too fast. Most refrigerators operate just under 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's perfect. The graph to the right was a quickie I put together to visually demonstrate the activity curves of both yeast and bacteria as the temperatures are increased. The most important thing to glean from this is that bacteria and yeast run a similar trajectory, up to and around 120 degrees Fahrenheit. This complementing alignment is part of the magic of bulk fermentation. Sourdough actually should not be subject to cold fermentation. It should always be at a nice room temperature during bulk fermentation. Sourdough is different. Bacterial activity, yeast growth is critical in this type of product, and temperature plays a key role in the speed at which these processes and reactions occur. As you remember the simple line graph I laid out, it is possible, but how long do you want to wait? Now keep in mind that cold final proofing is not the same as bulk fermentation. Does elevation play a role in the speed of bulk fermentation? Short answer, yes. The higher you are, the less atmospheric pressure, which plays a factor in speeding up yeast activity in bread dough. Although the impact is usually minimal, pending the altitude, bakers will make adjustments. Some folks say reduction in yeast of about 25% is common at altitudes above 3,000 feet. Here are some of the basic guidelines you can start with when planning your first overnight fermentation. This first step is making a control and then adjusting slightly from there. The notable changes are with yeast and mix times, which after 1 or 2 times using this process, you should be easily able to dial in your optimum yeast level. Here's what the guidelines start to look like as you start extending the times. Now notice the yeast and the mix time trends. So you made your first control dough and placed it in a container. You put it in the fridge, and after your planned cold fermentation time, you check it out, it's doubled in size. Perfect. Your yeast levels are in nice balance with your dough hydration, temperature, and the time you planned for. If for any reason your dough is coming faster than you planned based on your time objectives, then you have some options, as I've listed here. Even under the best of circumstances and using very little yeast, if you're targeting for cold fermentation lasting 3, maybe even 4 days, then the chances are good you will exceed double in size at some point in your process. At this point, it is important to perform some type of a punch back. Allowing the CO2 gas to build up for too long without releasing it will eventually choke your yeast and cause it to die, just like humans. This is alleviated through a gas release or punch back step. In some instances, bakers will simply knock the gas out and give the dough a few gentle folds in the container, while yet others prefer to pre-shape their dough, which through handling releases the CO2 gas. In both instances, the product is worked quickly and placed directly back into the refrigerator as soon as possible to not allow it to warm up too much. Now, 2 punch-back stages are quite common. However, 3 is not unheard of and always are performed at double in size. Now, I recommend adjusting your yeast levels even lower because after 2 double in size punchbacks, the yeast has or is getting close to exhausting the dough of the food it needs to continue growing, so I would not recommend pushing it past this point if you want to ensure a strong rise in your final proof. Here is a perfect example of a pizza dough at 75% hydration that has been subject to a 3-day cold fermentation. dry, strong, and amazing aroma. It was probably the best pizza crust I personally had ever eaten, and we'll have a full video from my award-winning Italian chef friend coming next. Holy smokes, JP, I thought this video was about the easiest way to make bread with the least amount of handling and work. You know, easy peasy. Well, it actually is. So let's take a look at the process. Well, I've got to scale my ingredients. I have to mix the dough, of course. I got to add water at a temperature doesn't let the dough get above 78. And then I got to dump it into a container, place it in the fridge. Now, that doesn't seem too bad for the first day's work. Now, the next steps really aren't that much. I mean, you got to scale the dough, you got to shape the dough, you got to put it in a pan or proof basket, and you got to final proof it and bake it. You know, if you have a longer fermentation period planned, then you can simply follow the same steps, except your final proof in the refrigerator. Or you have an obvious plan C, which includes just a quick degas, and then back to the cold for finishing up your fermentation plan. As you can see, it doesn't really get any easier with respect to direct handling time. 10 or 15 minutes more of fiddling and you're done. I just want to interrupt here and say when you're doing a control recipe, keep an eye on it. A few extra checks here will help you get this process completely dialed in. Now keep in mind, when I gave you the guidelines for the control or the first test dough, I based yeast on a middle-of-the-road percentage based on flour. You can see that the water or hydration versus yeast level recommendation spans 10%. This is the reason why you need to watch your very first dough. If your plan is 16 hours, check it after say 10 hours to see where it's at with respect to double in size. Depending where you live in the world and the seasonal temperatures considered plays a big part in the overnight plan. If you live where it's hot like me, I always lean on the cooler side after mixing and try hard not to let my dough warm up much between the mixer bowl and the refrigerator. Now 72 degrees Fahrenheit or 22 C is on the cool side, and some bakers may disagree. But let me tell you, at 35 to 36 Celsius every day and not much different at night, I prefer a bit of a cushion built in. If you are in a moderate climate, then take your time. Follow the basic mixing temperature guidelines. If your climate is cool to cold, then maybe adding a bit more yeast and even warm water to get you up to your 78 or 79 target finished dough temperature. So when planning my overnight dough, I make my control based on some predetermined guidelines and observations. I'll use a locally available bread flour. I'll mix for 1 minute low and around 9 minutes on second speed. I'll use 68% water in my dough based on the recipe I selected. I'm going to start with 1% yeast as per the guidelines for overnight fermentation and finishing on the next day. I'll include additional ingredients as per the recipe like sugar, olive oil. My climate is warm and my kitchen is not air conditioned, so I used cold water, but the dough after mixing was 78 degrees Fahrenheit anyway. I think generally my refrigerator works quite well and keeps things at a good temperature, even though I've never actually really checked it. But my plan is to make bread in about 14 hours. And as I mentioned, my kitchen is quite warm at around 28 or around 82 degrees Fahrenheit. So let's see how the dough does based on these standards and the factors which will determine how close to plan I actually get. So the next day I'm ready to get baking. The first thing I notice is that my dough feels good and forms a nice window pane. Mix time perfect based on my flour protein. Based on the consistency of my dough, I think I want it a little bit tighter next time, so I'm going to adjust my water to 66% for the flour I'm using. I checked the dough after 12 hours and decided to get at it as it already was double in size, so I'll reduce my yeast to 0.75% for my next dough. Other ingredients added as per the recipe, adjustments none. I'll use ice water next time to get my final dough temperature a bit cooler, say around 24. The cold water I used was just not quite cold enough based on the mix time. I really want to be closer to the 14-hour mark because this fits my schedule better. So by reducing yeast, tightening up the dough, and finishing the mix at a bit cooler of a temperature, I think this should do the trick. The beauty is that once you get your basics sorted and understand, you can get real close to your plan near every single time. So now, regardless of whether this was a quick overnight fermentation or a multi-day plan, eventually you'll prepare for final proof. Step 1, remove the dough from the container. If the dough is more than one product, gently cut it into pieces to the planned weights. Then round it and pre-shape it. Let it rest for about 15 to 30 minutes on the counter. After this brief rest, final shape your dough and place in the couche, Benetton basket, or pan you'll be using for final proof. Now, I don't know what type of bread you'll be making or the recipe or hydration you'll use. However, because you mixed your dough on the first day and further conditioned the gluten with time, you can usually go directly to your recipe's recommended method for final shaping and proofing, skipping all the steps in the middle.